Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinar is schools financial benchmarking and the role of governance within that. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. I think we've got quite large numbers of governors actually joining us today. So if you're not familiar with the platform, if you haven't yet located the go-to toolbar, there'll be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it somewhere in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that little orange box, it will open the toolbar, and amongst other things, that will give you access to the handout to download, and that's a copy of all the slides we're going to be sharing with you today. You'll also see the question box there, questions in white copy in a little grey box. If you've got any questions or comments at all throughout the session, please do not hesitate in asking them. Use the box if you will, and just hit submit and it will appear in front of us, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them. And so we've got very large numbers on this session today, so we may not be able to give everybody name recognition on that, but we will actually try and group the questions together as they come in. And last but by no means least, if I can ask you, there's also a little hand icon on that toolbar. If you can hear me, just by way of a sound test, would you mind just clicking on that hand icon now? That's lovely. I can see lots of people doing that. Perfect. Okay, so it looks like we're all set to go. Thank you very much indeed. As I say, a very warm welcome. That's me on the left-hand side of your screen, Steve Barker, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And between us, Linda and I will actually guide you through this session today. We're here representing Better Governor. Better Governor is an online resource for everybody involved in school governance, both in the maintained sector and in academies, and we're delighted to be working again with Governors for Schools this morning. So with no more ado, we'll set off and just establish the aims of the session today. First and foremost, obviously, what we want to do is to bring a little bit of clarity to where we believe financial benchmarking sits within the overall roles and responsibilities of governance. And as I say, this is a reasonably generic aspect of governance, so exactly the same applies in both academies and maintained schools. There's lots of different benchmarking information out there. We're going to focus our attention this morning on exploring some of the sources that are available through the Department for Education. The benefit of doing that, of course, is that there is a consistent way of gathering information there that does mean that we're all looking at benchmarking from a very similar perspective. And obviously, as we go through, what we'll be trying to do, as we always do, is think about the sort of questions as governors should be asking. And one of our key focus points, I guess, on benchmarking from everything else is that what it should do is fuel our questions, as well as hopefully guiding us towards that position where we're gaining greater assurance about the effectiveness of finance in our schools. So as I say, just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments you wish to make as we're going through, please do actually put those on the panel. One question has actually just come through already just before we kick off. A governor who's actually saying that the schools requires improvement at the moment and has a £0.6 million deficit in 3 years. How does this contextualise the questions we should be asking? It absolutely does, and I think hopefully as we go through, we will actually come to that. I think obviously if the school is in an Ofsted category, some of the pressures in terms of where we might be spending our money are somewhat greater. They're actually accentuated in certain areas more than others, but we will attempt to actually cover that as we go through. But please do feel free to come back at me on that a little bit later. Okay, so firstly, what we want to think about is the the role of governance, and if as governors we are doing what we should be doing, I think it's actually really important for us that we actually, for all aspects, and that includes finance and specifically benchmarking within finance, we're aware of what the correct path is to actually stay on here in terms of expectations. So I'm not going to dwell for very long on this at all, but just to remind us, this is what legislation and statutory requirement for both academies and maintained schools says that our role as governors is actually all about. And of course, we have the third of these bullet points here is actually all about the financial well-being of the school, ensuring sound, proper and effective use of schools' financial resources. And of course, that's where we're actually positioning this today. Benchmarking very much sits within that context. And we always like to share with you the background guidance documents. There are two key documents to actually think about as far as school finance is concerned in general, but benchmarking specifically. Governance handbook, of course, tells everybody involved in governance, again, irrespective of whether you're in an academy or a maintained school, what the basic aspects of compliance are. And obviously it also echoes the expectations that the Department for Education, government in general, has of school governance wherever it's operating. We're not suggesting this as bedtime reading, of course we're not. It's a very comprehensive document, but as a reference point for any queries that any governors have, or clerks for that matter, this is a very good place to start. Supplemented by a slightly older document, or more mature document, competency framework, published back in January 2017, and the competency framework spells out the areas of expectation, but actually looks at it from more of an aspirational perspective in terms of what best practice in governance looks like. One of the areas of competence is revolving all around accountability, and there are two specific sections within that all about school finances, and we're actually going to look at those in just this next slide now. For those of you who are perhaps unfamiliar with the competency framework, it's split into 3 areas. There are 6 areas of competency altogether, but there is a common format that splits each of those areas of competency into sometimes these 3 areas that we're showing here color-coded. Blue relating to everybody on the governing body or the governing board, the orangey colour in the middle to a specific individual, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, and then the imperial purple at the bottom relating to the chair. And as you can see on the one in the middle, we've only used this just for illustrative purposes, but you will get those are split into the knowledge that is expected of us individually, collectively, and of the chair, and then what the DfE refers to as the skills and effective behaviours, or in other words, the characteristics that we bring. And the relevance of this to what we're talking about today goes to everybody on the board. So this blue section at the top on the right-hand side of this slide, and you will see by this area that I'm just highlighting now, the expectation is that everybody, and this is one of the characteristics, everybody participates in the organisation, and that just means the school or the trust, in the organisation's self-evaluation of activities relating to financial performance, efficiency and control. And of course, self-evaluation activities are in essence benchmarking. So that's the background to where we're coming from this today. Coming from as far as this is concerned today. And we thought a good start point would be just to explore what do we mean by this term benchmarking. And benchmarking from the perspective of an education setting is possibly a little bit different from what some of us may be familiar with, but the principles are broadly the same, I would suggest. First and foremost, it's actually a process of measurement and comparison. We're actually looking at various aspects of the school's financial performance, of course, and then we're looking to compare those with other schools. Now, of course, what we do as far as that comparison is concerned within education is look at that from the perspective of, have we got some statistical neighbours or schools that have similar characteristics as us, either locally or slightly farther afield, so that those comparisons become more relevant to our own setting. And of course, now we have a situation where we have schools grouped together in multi-academy trusts, as well as a number of standalone schools, some as academies, but obviously the majority operating with a local authority context. So whatever the context of our school, it is possible, with the variety of different tools out there and available, to make that comparison more realistic from a similarity perspective. Quick question here from Mills. Mills is saying, does everybody include governors, local governors within a multi-academy trust? To be honest with you, I think in my simplistic mind, the answer is yes, it does, because we should all be doing comparisons. The lead for benchmarking in a multi-academy trust may be taken by the trust board, but it will all depend, as you say, Mills, on what that scheme of delegation actually looks like. Does it give any financial powers to the local governing board, or whatever it happens to be called in your multi-academy trust? I think from a local governance perspective, it is, however, about at school level thinking about how we compare, because the benchmarking tool does not compare trust with trust, it actually compares individual schools with other individual schools.
This is a question that's come up in the trust that I'm a chair of one of the local boards, and this was a conversation that we had at the chairs meeting of the multi-academy trust. What is the role of the local board? They may not have that delegation, but what is the role of the local board in terms of feedback, participation in the overall process of benchmarking at trust level? What time of the year does it occur? Is it a continual process? What feeds into it? How are those comparisons made? So it's even if it's not explicit in your scheme of delegation, clearly your local school is operating on the funds that are allocated to it. So there is some kind of benchmarking responsibilities there, even if it isn't a full delegation. So what's your role? Define what that might look like, and be aware that this is how your school operates.
And to be perfectly honest, as we go through this session this morning, and you'll see some of those various benchmarking tools and also sources of data, hopefully it'll become obvious what we are looking at, because we are looking at data on individual school level. Question has come through from Ian to say, is it possible to compare MAT top slicing? I don't believe that is something that the DfE actually benchmarks. For the most part, if you're interested in that, I think you can actually do your own benchmarking, and that's just by going on to other trust websites, and it's not a statutory requirement to publish it, but lots of trusts do actually publish what their top slice. What that means is that's the equivalent of a local authority retaining some of the funding from schools to cover the cost of its central services. Okay, so just going back to this slide that we have in front of us at the moment, I've talked the first 2 bullet points. The last 3 bullet points are basically what the Department for Education is saying they see as the key opportunities stroke benefits of benchmarking. Firstly, that it is actually an aid to planning. It helps us with planning in our individual schools and also in trusts. It also helps us make change, because obviously if what it's doing is actually throwing up perhaps some discrepancies in terms of ratios in our school compared to ratios in others, then perhaps that might be something we want to act upon, possibly to improve that comparison. But they also make the point that it does have limitations. It's not a perfect science. It doesn't provide definitive answers, but what it is a valuable tool to planning, which could lead to change. And I think just linking to that last bullet point there about having limitations, something that Linda and I are always very keen to say to governors is represented on this next slide, which is of itself, benchmarking does not provide answers. What benchmarking does and what it should do, what it's intended to do, is to generate questions, specifically questions from us as governors. And at this stage, we just want to very quickly just run a little bit of a poll, which is actually just going to get you to think about for a moment, if you will, the status that benchmarking has in your school or your trust at the moment. So hopefully that poll should be in front of you now. My screen says it is. So you've got the question about the role that benchmarking plays in your school or trust right now. It's multiple choice. Please tick all of those that apply. If you're new to this go-to platform and you're having difficulty perhaps accessing the panel, just try minimizing your screen for a moment. That often actually frees up the voting panel. You can maximize back up to full screen mode as soon as you've done that. But I can see lots of you are finding your way around. A third of you have voted already, so we'll give you a few moments just to read the slide and make your choices. Okay, we've got comment has just gone up on the board. A couple of comments from one or two governors that say that they don't know the answer to the question, so haven't ticked anything. That's fine. If you don't know, then hopefully this session will be of value in terms of perhaps suggesting some follow-up and some actions coming out of the session today. Okay, so it looks like we've got just about everybody voted. There's a few people left to vote. If you would like to vote, I'll give you another few seconds, and then we're going to close that poll down in the interest of moving forward. And again, we've got several people saying I'm a new governor, etc. That's absolutely fine. As new governors, we're thrilled that you've actually taken the time to join us this morning. Hopefully this will be helpful in terms of guiding you on that pathway to the use of benchmarking as we go forward. Okay, I'm going to close that poll there and we'll share those results with you. And they should. There we go. It'll take a few moments to actually come up there, sorry. So we've got some interesting numbers here. Obviously, they don't add up to 100 because we've asked you to tick all that applied. So we'll just go through them in the order that we asked the questions. Just under half of you are saying, yes, it features as part of your annual work programme. So this is something that's scheduled into the work of your governing body, and is something that hopefully everybody is reasonably familiar with. Just over a third of you said it's a process that is led by governors and trustees. Now that's a little bit of a leading question in many ways, as I'm sure many of you realised, because actually that's the expectation. It should be something that is done with us, is led by us, rather than a process that's actually done to us as governors. 65% of you are saying it's presented to the full governing board. That's good, it should be, but again, caveat on that is that there should have been governor input into it before it gets to there. The more worrying statistic for me is that over half of you are saying that it's a process that's led by school business managers. School business managers, bursars, chief financial officers, whatever the title of that person leading the finance in your school, it is not designed benchmarking as an activity that should be led by them, because in many ways it's something that should be open to governing boards right from the very start of the process, because actually governors can bring that independence of questioning that actually brings value to the process. Of course there's going to be involvement and value that school business managers actually bring to this process in terms of perhaps answering some of those questions, but it's not a process that should be solely in their domain and then presented on a platter to us as governors. And then we've got another 40% of you saying that it does actually inform your annual review of staffing structure. Well, that's good, because it should. And again, if we think about one of those DfE advantages in terms of planning and perhaps putting together options for change, then that would be a very good example of that. So we've got quite a few comments and questions actually coming in. Rosemary's put a comment on here saying, in our school it tends to be a collaborative approach, so I probably tick several boxes. That's absolutely fine, Rosemary, which that's the advantage of this type of poll, and that's really what we were actually after, is to recognise that governors can't do it alone. School business managers and the like should not be doing it alone either, because if they do, it's not a complete process. So the object of this poll is really to actually point out that it should be a process that involves lots of different stakeholders, so to speak. Okay, so I'll hide those results there and we'll go back to the slide. Sorry, it's taking a little moment. I think it's because we've got so many people on the call, everything's taking that much longer to actually respond today. Okay, let's move on at that stage, because what I want to do next is actually go to one of the DfE benchmarking sites. There are several of these, as I've actually indicated, and the first one I want to take you over is actually the benchmarking part of the .gov.uk website, which is hosted by the DfE anyway. You can see that this is actually called Compare Your School or Trust's Budget Financial Benchmarking, and this is the start point. And the important point for us as governors on this is that it does give us options on where we go next. The red box, or sorry, the pinky box at the top here is that website. You can then go either directly to the school's financial benchmarking element itself, and we're going to visit that in just a moment, or you can actually go to one of two options, which are tailor-made for either maintained schools or for academies, represented by those boxes at the bottom there. Apologies for the abbreviations, but there's too many words to actually get on the little box. But SFVS, if you're not aware, stands for Schools Financial Values Standard, and we will come back to that a little bit later. And then SRM is School Resource Management Self-Assessment Tool, which is the academy equivalent. They're virtually identical documents, they're just slightly differently front facing of the web page really. But what we're going to do, as I say, is actually start on this section in the middle, the school's financial benchmarking. This is a section linked to that previous slide, and this is accessible to all schools, whether you're an academy, whether you're a multi-academy trust, or whether you're a standalone school. And once you get to this section of the website, it allows you to set a default school, and you can see the default school down here where my cursor is at the moment. Happens to be a school, but an academy trust, as a standalone academy, happens to be where I'm chair of governors, which of course is why I've actually got this data to hand. I'm not sharing state secrets with anybody. All of this is in the public domain, and any of you can chase any school whatsoever. Not a problem. Just a little segue, I can see we've got lots of people at the moment asking questions about can we get the slides. You can actually download the slides at any stage during the broadcast. You won't lose sight of the PowerPoint. Just click on the document icon on the toolbar. If you have any difficulty, just let us know and we'll happily forward them to you afterwards. But you can download them now. Just click on that little document icon on the go-to toolbar, and it will actually download in the background for you. So, just before we move on, just to actually show you, this is what the locator tab actually looks like. So I've got my own default school there, as you can see on the pink bordered box on the left, but you can actually search by an individual school name, which is what I've done. URN or LA establishment tab code, those are just the individual numbers that identify individual schools. You don't need to know that as a governor. If you do know it, it might help you to locate it, but a school name is always the best by. You can do it by location, where it allows you to search by postcode, so you can compare with a number of schools in your locality, or you can actually do it by local authority. And local authority, of course, includes London boroughs and other metropolitan areas as well. So once we've actually decided what we want to look at, we can then click the various button, and as I say, we're sticking with my own school here just for demonstration purposes, but I just wanted to show you this slide to give you an indication of what the options are. You can go back to the school characteristics and you can actually define those yourself. I've actually left it as standard here, but just so you know, there is quite a large element of scope for individualization here. You've got the various actions in terms of download, all of the data, the page or print off, etc. But the bit I wanted to point out to you is the tabs on the bottom here. You can see that I've clicked the expenditure tab, and that's what we're going to look at in just a moment. But you've also got one on income. You've got one on balance, and of course balance just means, is the school in deficit or not? Did it have a positive carry forward last year, or not, as the case may be? In other words, is it in a deficit? So it's not something that is of that interest to most schools from a benchmarking perspective, because hopefully you would actually know that already. There's also a section on workforce data, that's slightly more detailed comparisons on staffing. If we just move forward onto the next slide, I can show you what this actually gives you. So I've clicked, as I say, on the expenditure slide, and what this will always do is give you basically all the schools that fit dependent on the criteria that you've put in. And because the school, Collingwood College, where I'm chair of governors, happens to be in Surrey, I actually limited this to the same local authority. So it's picked, as you can see here, 10 other schools to actually compare with from the perspective of the total expenditure of each of those schools. And you can see Collingwood and the school that you choose as your school to benchmark others against will always show up in this magenta shade in the middle there, and Collingwood happens to be bang in the middle of that range there, but you can see it is quite a range, goes from 7.21 million up to 13.35. So of course, yeah, that in itself one could describe as interesting. Interesting is a word I don't particularly like from a governance perspective. If we say that things are interesting, it implies that we don't find it terribly useful. Whereas what we should be ensuring as governors is that the data is useful. And the use, of course, is that this could fuel some questions. So for example, I might say to you, Collingwood College is one of the largest schools in Surrey. It's just under 2,000 pupils. George Abbott is not as big as that, but there's quite an interesting discrepancy in the total expenditure there. Now, of course, you know, some of us will know some of the context, but actually if we don't, that actually begs a question. I mean, it happens to be that George Abbott is a teaching school, and I would guess that a lot of their expenditure there is related to their teaching school status. But of course, a really good question for us to think about here, if we don't know the answers, is, well, what are the factors that actually influence the range here? The range being from 7.2 up to that 13 plus at the top. And you know, the answers to that could actually lead us to do a little bit more investigation. It could actually lead us to think about, well, are there other sources of funding that the school might want to attract in order that we could get our expenditure levels up to that of similar schools? We've got a number of questions actually coming through the panel here. Adrienne is asking, how is the size of school factored into this? It's not always factored in. You'll get about, quite a few pointers to that. You can, within primary, set certain parameters, and I think pupil numbers is actually one of them. The system isn't perfect, it's fair to say, Adrienne. And again, when we're benchmarking, if you're in a primary school, this happens to be secondary, but it works the same for primary. If you're in primary, of course, the system, because it varies from authority to authority, does not distinguish between Key Stage 1 only schools, Key Stage 2 only schools, and through primaries. So you are part of that sector that includes all three of those different elements. So you have to be very clear on what you're looking at, and you have to be aware of the limitations. But as I say, this isn't about finding answers. This is actually about fueling our questions. I can see quite a number of people asking questions about the fact it's old data here. Yes, it absolutely is. And of course, you have to recognize that with academies, the data is actually going to be lagging slightly behind that of maintained schools. That's purely as a consequence of the financial year. For maintained schools, the financial year starts on the 1st of April and finishes 31st of March. For academies, it's 1st of September, finishing on August 31st. And therefore, of course, once all the data has been collated by the department, it does take a little while for that to actually be processed and ultimately published. So yet there is always a lag here. And of course, what we would then ask as governors is, okay, well, this is oldish data here that we're looking at. Has that position changed? Is it likely to have changed? Is our position within this particular table we're looking at markedly different this year from last year? So ultimately, we have to be aware of what we're looking at as far as the data, but again, we will also know things about our schools. So for example, we've got a question here. David is saying that we've got a resource base which also skews some benchmarking in terms of expenditure and income. Can this be taken into account? Yeah, it absolutely can, David. The fact you know that that's there means it's something that you would actually want to look out for. Certainly, when you say a resource base, I'm assuming you mean for special educational needs and disabilities. One of the other schools where I'm chair, we have a similar facility, and the reality is that you can look at the percentage of, or the instance of, special needs within the school and use that as a filter. So you can shape the data any way you want, but of course what this is doing for you, and I don't know whether you realize here, but each of these schools listed down here, you can actually look individually at that school and find out more about it, including those very specific characteristics that a lot of you are actually asking questions about at the moment.
The other point that I'd make there, the other point I'd make there, Steve, is that at the earlier on in the presentation, what you were saying to participants is that this doesn't give you all the answers. Benchmarking is a process which should generate questions, and you're asking those kind of questions now, and those are the kind of questions that should inform that discussion. And that the process of benchmarking itself. So what does make us different? Does that explain some of this, or is there more that we need to ask to understand this? And first and foremost, if you're new to this process, if as a board member you're doing this for the first time, participating for the first time, you will have a lot more building of your own understanding about your school and its context against other schools that you're comparing yourself to. And so this is absolutely part of the process, this generating questions to gain a deeper understanding of whether you are actually comparing well against your own context and what you found out that about yourself as a part of the exercise.
Indeed. I think there will be a whole host of questions from governors on this call this morning. That's absolutely fine. Keep those coming. We will try to answer as many as we can, but as I say, we are getting lots and lots of questions at the moment. One or two on balances in terms of what's the ideal balance. An ideal balance is a positive one for obvious reasons. Most local authorities will, schools can't just opt to run a deficit. If you're a maintained school, that needs licensing by the local authority. And if you're an academy, it's virtually an absolute no-no and can actually lead to quite high levels of intervention from the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So all governing bodies have a statutory duty to submit a balanced budget, and there is no such thing as a school choosing to run a deficit. That is not a position that's tenable over time, and it's not one that will be tolerated either by local authorities or by the Education and Skills Funding Agency, which is part of the Department for Education, because of course this is public money, and if you have a deficit one year, which is an in-year deficit, your budget for the next year has to show how that deficit is actually going to be recovered from. So you create a very difficult situation for your schools if you're in that situation. And I can see quite a few questions that actually come through on that. A couple of people have actually asked questions saying, what if it says there's no data on my school? It won't be that there isn't any data on your school. It will be because you've actually set the parameters for the sort of data that you want to look that mean there aren't enough schools to actually compare with. So it's not that your school's data isn't there, it's that you've actually set perhaps slightly too tighter ranges for some of the data. So if you've said you only want to look, for example, at schools with more than 10% instance of special educational needs and 20% or more English additional language, and again, please don't quote me on that, I'm just picking that as a specific, it may well be that there aren't enough schools that fall into that category that meet both those criteria that enable you to actually get 10 schools to compare with. Okay, let's move on and look at the next slide here. So that first one is total expenditure, something which, and again, for me, as I say, we should be finding this useful rather than interesting. if we're honest, one school spends more than another, it's a challenge to actually say that that is anything other than just of interest. What is useful, however, is actually when we look at what that expenditure relates to in terms of the cost of staffing. And again, you can see that some of the schools have actually jumped in position. This is looking at the same basket of schools as on the previous slide, and you can see that there are some fairly significant amounts of expenditure, and there's also some quite big variation here. I have to say, as a governor at Collingwood, I was actually quite heartened that we're in the middle of overall expenditure, and actually we're just about in the middle on this one as well. But of course, this does lead you to say, well, somebody like Tomlinscote, for example, and if I just flick back, sorry, wrong one, flick back to the last slide, you've got Tomlinscote on this slide, where total expenditure in the year 10.3, but in that same year, they're right at the top, spending 9.52. Now, in terms of those conversations we just had about balances, deficits, etc., there's some interesting questions. My apologies if there's any governors from Tomlinscote on the call this morning, but this is all public domain information. But so you would be exploring, well, hang on a minute, as a proportion of our budget, we've actually got some fairly stark differences here. These can all be expressed in percentage as well, by the way. So, and of course, what you will be able to, we've got lots of people asking questions about how does this compare size of schools. All of these, you can actually click onto the individual school, and in terms of size, most people would judge size by numbers of pupils. All of that information is available. So you might not be able to get it just by clicking on the slide, but it doesn't take that many minutes to actually gather that information together. So, of course, questions that we might want to think about asking here if we don't already know the detailed answer. Firstly, what are the influences in terms of that mid position for our school here in the table versus lower down overall? Now, we weren't that much farther lower down, of course, but it does imply that we are spending slightly more money than the average on our staffing bill. Now, hopefully, as governors, as trustees, you'll be aware that that might be because of the leadership team size, it might be because of the experience and therefore the salary rates of your staff, but that will have implications elsewhere, hopefully in terms of pupil progress, standards overall, etc. And again, that question at the top that relates to that first school there, what are the reasons behind them spending so much more as a total proportion of expenditure on staffing than most other schools in the selection there? And again, if that was your school, that could be a major cause for concern, because that probably isn't sustainable over time. Staffing is not the only cost to schools. It's the most significant one, of course, but it's not the only one. Okay, let's move forward there. So some of the questions that, as governors, we need to, I would suggest, perhaps reflect upon. Again, it's not about asking these questions all at the same time, but it is about saying, well, which of these questions are relevant for me to ask? The most important one, and again, this is a reflective question, do we collectively as a governing board, or do I individually understand why my school or my trust context is actually going to dictate where we sit within these benchmarks? Because of course these are not arbitrary numbers, these are the collation of all of the data available from our school. And I just gave you the example of the structure of a leadership team a few moments ago. If there are historical reasons why your leadership team has evolved the way it is, and it may well be that you've got fewer middle leaders than you have senior leaders, there'll be very good reasons for that, and hopefully the governing body will be involved in shaping some of those decisions, but that will have an impact on some of the benchmarking data that comes out. When we look at the benchmarking data, and again, we always have to put this in context of, yes, it's 12 months, 12 months old at the very least at the moment. It might be slightly more than that, but are there some changes that we might need to contemplate? If you were a governor in that school that is actually spending, in excess of 90% of its overall expenditure is going into staffing at the moment, my guess as a governor would be there is some very real change that needs contemplation there. Do we understand what actions we could take to improve our position in that ranking, in that benchmarking data, if in fact that's something we thought was appropriate for us to do? It might not be, but it is an option. And of course, then we need to think about, is there that benefit? And a lot of you have touched on this already, that we need to actually explore a deeper level of understanding of what each of those schools is doing to actually put them in the position that they're in. So yeah, following the links on those individual schools and actually saying, well, okay, how do we compare? How much bigger than us are they? And you will find there is an awful lot more data available to download there than might initially meet the eye. So those are just summary charts that we've actually been looking at. What I want to do now is just move on and focus on the school's financial value standard and the school resource management self-assessment toolkit. And as I said to you in the introduction, these are virtually identical. One is for maintained schools, SFVS, and the schools resource management, the SRM, is for academies. But actually the processes, the charts, everything are identical for both. Obviously what they're doing is just comparing different sets of schools. And we have within the school's financial value standard and the SRM, the ability to do some benchmarking. It's some very focused benchmarking, but the reason I've included this today is because it's very timely. The deadlines for both of these are coming up. Therefore, this is something, at least at a fairly top level view, is an aspect of benchmarking. If you've never looked at before, ask in your school that this can be shared at a full governing body so that actually you can get your head around it and understand where this actually fits. So the dashboard basically is your data from your school or your schools, if it's actually a trust situation that you're in. And as I say, for me, this is something that probably the checklist that comes with this is the self-evaluation part, and then there's a final question that requires the governing board to actually look at this dashboard, which is the benchmarking data, and form a view on whether there are any actions that need to be pursued in the following 12 months as a consequence of this. And what you'll see here, we've got B is the box I want to focus predominantly on. This is spending as a percentage of total. We'll say a little bit about the balance in just a few moments, but the expenditure is box B here. Box A is just information about your school, just in terms of name and number, etc. But this is the other end of the spectrum. This happens to be a primary school that we're looking at the data for here, and you can see from the various benchmarks that we've got here: teaching staff as a percentage, supply staff, educational support staff, right the way down to resources and energy at the bottom. And for each one of those, it will give you, in this column here where I'm hovering my cursor at the moment, the school's data, it will show you what the percentages are for your school. They will all add up to 100%. If they don't, something's gone wrong in terms of the data input. And then what it will do is rate your school. In other words, it will benchmark your school against each of those thresholds based on, again, it's the older data, it's for 2019 data still, but most schools won't have changed many of these significantly over the last 12 months. And if they have, obviously it's a question that we might want to ask. The DfE uses a form of RAG rating here, so red, amber, and green. They don't always mean the same thing. Sometimes the lowest or the highest can both be red, but that's because it's the 10% trigger. So the thresholds here are what determine the RAG rating. So for example, if you're in the lowest 10%, you might think that's good. Actually, it might not be. It might mean that you're not spending enough potentially on teaching staff. Why are other schools spending significantly more? So if you're in the lowest 10%, that will trigger a red flag, just really to hopefully point to governors that we should be asking some questions about that. Similarly, if you drop down 2 boxes there to the education support staff, there you're in the highest 10%. Now, I can tell you this is a school I know, and this is a school that actually does have a special needs resource centre attached to it, and therefore there are probably significantly higher numbers of teaching assistants supporting individual children with special needs and disabilities in this school. So it is no surprise that you're in the highest 10%, but again, that's was governors, a fact that if we didn't know, we ask a question about, and therefore it suddenly makes it actually a little bit more relevant. We can see where context of our individual school is dictating where we sit within that. Similarly, broadly in line. Now you might say, well, broadly in line means that we don't need to be worried about that. I would still suggest you look at the numbers, but yes, if it's green, then you should be relatively comfortable with what that's saying to you. As far as the energy is concerned, this is saying that this particular school is in the highest 20%. So again, if it was the highest 10%, it would be red, but because it's 20%, you're getting slightly lower down, so that's flagging up as an amber rating. And there is an explanation of how those thresholds work within the template as well. But hopefully you can see just at a glance here, the RAG rating A is flagging up probably the ones that we need to look at most. I would suggest that there's only 10 lines there, so it's not a huge amount of work to actually look at all of them. But this is this is fuel for a very sharply focused 15-20 minute conversation in the governing board meeting, and could be a very valuable insight for all of us, whether we're new governors or more established, of course. Just very quickly before we move on, box C here, reserves, balances. So this is actually telling you whether you've actually got a positive reserve. In other words, you've got cash in the bank, or if you're in a deficit, obviously that would be a negative figure there. So we've got the in-year balance. So that says, have we managed to balance our budget this year, or have we got what's called an in-year deficit? In other words, we've spent more money than we've actually received funding for this year, but we had a carry forward from last year, so we had money in the bank to be able to fund that. And again, then it's actually giving you an explanation underneath that of what that represents in terms of a percentage of your total income. So this school has got just under 14% of its income as a carry forward. That's quite high. And there might be very good reasons for that, but nonetheless, that's something as governors we should perhaps be querying, because of course one of the underlying principles in education is that money is actually delivered to schools based on the number of pupils actually within that school, and therefore there's a bit of a moral assumption, apart from anything else, that we should be spending that money on those pupils in the school, not squirreling it away in a war chest for some future date. Couple of questions. Tom is actually saying, don't special needs and disability and pupil premium make a massive difference in funding? It will depend entirely on your school, Tom. In some schools with perhaps a relatively low instance of special needs, and perhaps it's a more advantaged rather than disadvantaged area, pupil premium may be very, very low indeed, and the additional funding that the school gets for special needs would be similar. So again, that's all context. Context is absolutely invaluable in understanding what we're looking for. But yes, the parameters that you set, the criteria that you actually set in creating your benchmarking will point to some of those areas for you. And if you know that your school has, for example, 24% of youngsters attracting pupil premium, you would want to set that probably as one of your parameters, schools with a similar incidence of free school meal entitlement, etc. So again, obvious question there. It would, somebody's got to be in the lowest 10%, somebody's got to be in the higher 10%, but why is it us? What are the factors that contribute to us being in that lower 10%? Now, it may well be that you've got more newly qualified teachers than most other schools. It may well be that you've got a senior leadership team who have not been in post that long and therefore are on the bottom end of their pay scales, as opposed to more experienced people in other schools who are at the top end, etc. But there will be lots of reasons behind this, and again, the fact we're in the 10%, that's not an answer to anything, that's a statement of fact. What we need to do as governors is ensure that our questioning is actually enabling us to actually get underneath that and have a true understanding. We've got a question from Shane saying, does this expenditure model include capital expenditure? No, it doesn't. This is only revenue expenditure, and that's because capital is handled very differently in academies. It has to be bid for, so it's not automatically there. And of course, in maintained schools, it will depend on your status as a school, if you're a voluntary aided, voluntary controlled or community school, as to whether you're actually getting devolved formula capital. So no, this does not include capital expenditure.
I think it's worth saying here, Steve, that the same process applies to SFVS and SRM, as we talked about benchmarking earlier, that this is a shared activity that includes the school business manager, but absolutely should be led and participated in by governors.
Yeah, Absolutely. Quite a few sort of technical questions in terms of the way in which the site can be manipulated, increase the number of schools, compare year on year, etc. No, the school is not that flexible, but I think, and far be it for me to stick up for the Department for Education here, but I think one has to bear in mind there is 23,000 schools data actually fueling this benchmarking activity. So it can only work in certain ways, but realistically, if we're comparing with 10 schools on one parameter, perhaps a slightly different number on not parameter on one benchmarking activity, rather a different number on others, then we've got the benchmarking card, which I'll come to in a few moments. Yeah, you've got a lot of variety here. So I think, you know, part of me is actually thinking, well, this does give us the opportunity to get a very good insight. If it's not enough information, then I think we have to go digging perhaps round that. That's something that we shouldn't necessarily do ourselves as governors. Of course, that's probably absolutely something that we would actually be asking our school business managers to get involved in. Andrew is saying, should schools only budget 98% of their revenue for expenditure and 2% on contingency to manage difficulties? I think that's an interesting question, Andrew. It sounds like sensible budgeting practice, doesn't it? But of course, it does depend on the circumstances that we're in. It does depend on the risks that we attach to a lot of those factors. Some schools simply will not have the flexibility or the ability financially to build a contingency in. It's not considered good practice by educationalists to actually put money aside for contingency, but in my personal experience, and I don't know whether Linda has a view on this as well, most schools would tend to do that. Whether it would be as high as 2% is, you know, a moot point. That's something to be discussed at local level. But yeah, you do want to be cognizant of risk, and managing risk is a very significant element of financial prudence, shall we say, as far as schools are concerned. So I think it's a good point to make, but my view is it will vary tremendously from school to school.
I think I would add to that most school business managers and head teachers, when they're putting the initial figures together, they often work on worst case scenario numbers. So that in itself builds in contingency to some of that. Obviously, the unforeseen things, which is what contingency is often there to help us manage. They are very good at trying to make sure that they see what it would look like if it was at its highest number, and they put that in the budget, which usually builds that to a point where there is a little contingency if you face unexpected costs, COVID and pandemic notwithstanding, because they've been something quite unusual.
Couple of people are, or not couple, several people are asking, can we look at per pupil data? Yes, you absolutely can. On the benchmarking side, it gives you ratios such as number of pupils per teacher, number of teachers per pupil, curriculum spend per pupil. So there are lots of different ways of cutting the data, and there are lots of different sets within the data that you can actually look at. So I think we have to, have a look at the site, look at what the possibilities are, and then decide what you want to look at as a school. I mean, I would say it's sensible to actually have a discussion with your school business manager before you actually have this agenda item to say, well, what do we think are the things from our school that we actually ought to be looking at? Meredith made a good point here, saying that it's important to make sure that staffing costs are defined as in supply, cost of supply, teaching, support staff, etc. The benchmarking sites tend, Meredith, to be done on what's called common set of reporting principles. So there are universal codes that are used. Schools are required to use those for the submission of their data back to the department. So what we ought to find is that unless there have been mistakes at school's end, then teaching staff is teaching staff, supply, obviously something. It's always difficult, but there'll always be some odd ones that where schools don't have exactly the same ways of operating, but there should be some consistency in these descriptions, so that should not account for any huge discrepancies, I would suggest. Okay, let's move on at that stage. So just want to remind you, these are the two that we've just been talking about, the self-evaluation, which includes that element of benchmarking, and the dates for those, as you can see, they have been moved. It's normally the end of March for SFVS, now the end of May, and the date for the academies version has actually been pushed back to the 15th of April. So there is still time. That's why we thought this was a relevant and timely focus of today's session. There is still time for governors to actually get involved before these two particular elements are actually due for submission. The more formal benchmarking from the benchmarking website, you can do that at any time. You can schedule that whenever you like. It would make sense to do it in the run up to the budget setting process, of course, but that's there for schools to access at any stage in which they feel it appropriate to actually do that. Okay, and I just wanted to mention one other benchmarking asset that is actually available, asset resource, whichever we want to call it. And this is something called the benchmarking report card. Now you will see the date on this again, 2019-20. This has only just been sent to schools about 2-3 weeks ago. So again, always be aware of that caveat that we are not looking at very recent data just because of the time it takes to actually process and update this. Now, as a report card, this again has information, but it's benchmarking information. It's on a much smaller scale than the others because it is a report card. So this is very much supposed to be seen as a summary. And again, same as before, it actually raises questions. It doesn't provide answers. It uses a slightly different methodology. So what I've done is taken again that same teaching staff percentage of total expenditure as the measure that I've actually looked at, or the criterion that I've actually pulled out. And this is another school where I'm chair of governors, which is why this is not in the public domain. Has to be said, I've got the head teacher's permission to share this with you, but this is what we have been sent. This is our school, always in dark blue. The next school to it, and this is a quirk of it, is the next one geographically closest to you. Because of course, recognise here that this is England only data, but England goes from Northumberland down to Cornwall and from side to side as well. So we're talking about vast areas, and this really is done on much closer attention to similarities of characteristic and expenditure than the others, where you set your own. So you don't set your benchmark here at all. They are predetermined for you by the DfE, and this is just basically what they've done is saying, well, we've looked at your school, we've looked at the characteristics that define your context, and these are the schools that we think closest match your school in terms of those characteristics. Now, has to be said, Bagshot Infant School is in Surrey. Wessex Primary School, I haven't actually looked up where it is, but by the name, I'm guessing it's at least Hampshire, if not Dorset. So it's not exactly on our doorstep. And there have been a couple of comments on the panel to say that, we looked at this and the nearest schools were a couple of 100 miles away. That can happen, but of course, if you're going on to the other, if you think that the report card does not give you the value of information that you want because it's not looking at local schools, that's fine. Go onto the benchmarking site itself and set them for ones that are a 5-mile radius of your own postcode. That may come back to the other issue that we touched on earlier, which is that you don't get enough schools to draw fair comparison with, but you can change all of those. So again, this is not cast in stone. This particular element is slightly more rigid in construct than others, but it does give us flexibility. And what this may say is, well, look, we've looked at 3 different forms of benchmarking now. To be honest, even if we looked at that first one, which was for a secondary school, if we'd have looked at that for Bagshot Infant School, because that was Bagshot Infant School I was using on the previous example, on all of those, we can see that our expenditure on teaching staff proportionally puts us at the bottom of the pile. We're in the lowest 10% right the way across. And you can see here, that pink dotted line, that's the average for the sector. It's not the average of these schools, it's the average for the entire sector, and that's primary schools, of course. So that does lead us to ask some questions. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but we might say, well, as governors, do we understand why that's the situation, why our teaching staff expenditure proportionately is lower than in other comparable schools? We then get into that deeper level of understanding of, well, how comparable are they? Yeah, do they have the same level of special needs instances we have in our school? Do they have the same level of staff supporting individual children as we do? And all of those things, basically, it's a little bit like peeling the onion. The nearer we get to the middle of the onion, the deeper our level of understanding of why our school is structured the way it is. And it may well be that actually this all makes perfect sense. There is no real anomaly here because there's an explanation of everything, and we don't need to change. We don't need to plan for change. But actually that might not always be the case, and that's really what comes at the heart of this benchmarking process. So in summary, now I realise this has been a little bit of a gallop through, but hopefully we've given you a flavour for what benchmarking is all about. And hopefully, if nothing else, we've convinced you that it is something that as governors, whether we're at multi-academy trust level, local governance in trust, or in the maintained sector, all of us need to engage in the process, and all of us need to have a level of understanding of what it's actually telling us. The dates of submission for the two self-evaluations that have been put back, that does give us opportunities, as I say. And just that final reminder that, as we say, benchmarking does not give answers, it actually poses questions. And that neatly leads us into our last slide here. If there are any other questions, and we've got one or two on the panel, which I'll just come to now, then please do. If we don't get a chance to respond to all of them, we will actually respond to you individually after the session today. One question here we got from Lillian. Lillian saying, the meeting I attended with my school showed a large deficit carried forward and will continue to look so this year. However, I noticed a number of a capital expenditure in there, hence my question. You can't, sorry, the question is, can we strip out capital expenditure proportions before benchmarking? Capital expenditure should not be in there because actually your deficit is nothing to do with capital. It's a completely separate budget. So I would suggest you perhaps go back and just delve into that a little more deeply. The only explanation could be if the school has moved revenue, in other words, its normal funding, into its capital budget in order to actually fund a specific project. But the benchmarking does not include capital expenditure because it's actually funded in a totally different way, and that really wouldn't allow for effective benchmarking at all. So we've got a question from Peter. Peter's asking, is the school resource management self-evaluation tool completed at individual school and trust level? It is completed at individual school level is my understanding, because of course all of the budgeting and the benchmarking is done at school level. It might be completed by the trust, but nonetheless, I think it is something that from an effective governance perspective, again, it may depend on the way in which your scheme of delegation is structured, but it is something that governors at local level ought to be involved in, I would suggest. Ian is actually asking, is additional income included in the benchmarking, e.g. before and after school clubs and nursery? Yes, if you go to the revenues, so if you remember right back to the very beginning, we said I was looking at expenditure, one of the other slides was looking at revenue. Yes, it will give you sources of revenue. It won't identify all of them, of course, but things like teaching school structure, which was the example I gave, but if your school has significant lettings income, it will show that as other income, for example. But that's where the school business manager should be able to support governor understanding by pointing to some of the things that might be in that. But again, benchmarking is actually bringing up questions for us that hopefully we can then go away and find the answers to. Okay, well, we've given you the URLs for all of the various sites that we've actually mentioned this morning there, so if you'd like to follow those up, then please feel free to do so. That does bring us to the end of our session. We've run out of time, sadly. I am aware that there are some questions that we haven't responded to, but as I say, we'll get back to you directly after the event with those. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Thank you for the huge level of interaction. That makes it a lot more enjoyable from our perspective. Apologies if I've not kept pace with the tsunami of questions this morning, but I'm delighted there have been so many of them. We hope to see you again soon at future Governors for Schools webinars that we'll be hosting as Better Governor. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.